Hello, I'm your host, Michael Shermer. You're watching or listening to the SALON podcast. Thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. And if you find the podcast valuable, please support it through your donations and support at skeptic.com. You can just click on the donation button there on the homepage. Or you can click on our Patreon account, which we have on the homepage at patreon.com/skeptic. The Science Salon podcast grew out of our original Caltech Distinguished Science Lecture Series that we hosted for over 20 years at Caltech, and that morphed into our Science Salon live events. And now, thanks to technology, we're able to bring you these weekly dialogues with leading scientists and scholars. And I'm honored today to host Dr. Susan Blackmore. I've known Sue since the early 90s when we founded the Skeptics Society and Skeptic magazine in 1992. She was already a rock star in the skeptical movement because she was famous for having originally been a believer in the paranormal and the supernatural and ESP and telekinesis and all that. In fact, she's one of the few people to ever get a Ph.D. in the field of the paranormal. Then she became a skeptic of all of that simply because she tested it. She tested Karl Popper's idea of the falsifiability of science by running experiments and discovered that the tighter the controls are in studying the paranormal, the weaker the effects get to the point where they disappear. So she wrote books about this and lots of articles, and also wrote about her own near-death and out-of-body experiences, her astral projection, as it were, and then wrote a book called Dying to Live. And her career developed, and she wrote on consciousness, altered states of consciousness, and then consciousness itself, and all the problems that ensue. She's got a leading textbook on consciousness studies. She's got a small little booklet here called Consciousness, a very short introduction that kind of summarizes the issues in the field. And then she's probably best known in terms of her best-selling books for her book called The Meme Machine, in which she runs with Richard Dawkins' idea of the meme and develops a whole theory about it. She is a longtime professor first at the University of Plymouth and then at other universities. Her general fields of study are psychology and consciousness, but she has branched out from there. So without further ado, here's our conversation in which we talk about all these subjects, including some deep epistemological ones like the problem of internal subjective mystical experiences. How can they possibly be tested by science? How do we make them objective if they're by definition subjective? We also get into memes and her new research on tremes, that is, how memes can be developed by technologies like on the internet, artificial intelligence and so on, independent of us, and the implications of that. We also talk about free will and determinism, the hard problem of consciousness, God. Basically, we get into all the big subjects. So enjoy the conversation. So there's several threads I thought we could explore for the next hour or so. Most interestingly to my viewers, of course, is your skeptical background, and then we can get into consciousness and free will and God and the Mysterians and all that good stuff.
We're not going to run out of stuff.
But you're a few years ahead of me in terms of career, which is a nice way of saying you're older than me. And I'm often asked how I got into the skeptical movement, and I'm fond of giving a little bit of cultural background, social background to when I was in graduate school in the late 70s. And I didn't know much about any of this stuff, but I saw Uri Geller on television, and Thelma Moss had a lab at UCLA studying Kirlian photography and altered states of consciousness. And I always thought there might be something to it because, I'm just a lowly graduate student. Here's all these really smart people saying that there's something to it. So I thought, okay, well, I'll keep an open mind. And my advisor was very skeptical, Doug Navrick, even though now he's a little more open-minded than I am to these things. But you have an even richer background in this regard. You actually went and got a Ph.D. in parapsychology. So maybe go back in time and give us a little bit of background of what the culture and society was like for you when you got interested in the paranormal and why it seemed like a totally reasonable thing to study scientifically.
I can't help saying I actually bought a Kirlian photography machine and spent ages in a dark room, developing the pictures. But that was a few years later. To get to your question, I really didn't know what I wanted to do at school. I'd got places at medical school, and my parents really wanted me to be a doctor and all that. And at some point, I woke up in the middle of the night and sort of freaked out, and thought, I couldn't bear it. I don't want to be a doctor with ill people all my life. And I ended up really, for no terribly good reason, doing physiology and psychology at Oxford, which it turned out I loved. So good for me. I mean, that was very lucky how that came about, really. Anyway, I was just full of enthusiasm when I got there. Had been at this ghastly boarding school, all girls, locked in, gates, incredibly strict rules, no privacy, just awful. And suddenly here I am in Oxford. And so I joined loads of societies and, threw myself into life there. And one of the things I signed up for at Freshers' Fair was the Society for Psychical Research. And as far as I can remember, I'd only read one book on telepathy, Rosalind Hayes, I think. And that sort of intrigued me, but that was all. But I signed up for this thing anyway. And what happened was, a few days later, a young man, second year, knocked on my door in my room in college and said, I'm the only remaining member from last year of this society. Would you like to start it up again with me? And, he was very attractive and long curly hair and, really far out and cool man sort of clothes, And so I said yes. And that meant that I used to cycle around Oxford every week with little posters putting up to say, what this week's medium was coming to, connect us with the dead, or we'd have a Ouija board session, or we'd have a psychical researcher come and talk about telepathy experiments. And it was in the context of all this, which was a tiny part, really. I mean, it was just something, an evening a week or whatever, that I was sat around one evening having a Ouija board session, and I'd promised to my friends I would go up to Victoria's room afterwards and have a smoke and, chill out a bit. We didn't use that expression then, but anyway, I did this and was listening to music. And it seemed to me I was going down a tunnel of leaves. I should say this was 1970, and I was already quite used to smoking dope. And I smoked a little bit, but I remember that and I wrote this down in my diary, that it had too much, made me feel a bit weird and floaty and drifty, and I didn't like that, But on the other hand, I was gripped by this tunnel, going down this tunnel towards the light. And when Kevin said, just the three of us there, Kevin said, "Where are you, Sue?" Which is a very strange question. I mean, I could ask you, Michael, where are you? And you'll go, well, like, you can see me sitting here, can't you? Because I would have sat there on the floor opposite him. Anyway, that propelled me into wondering where on earth I am, trying to pull myself back together, think I'm in Victoria's room. And what happened was, instead of feeling myself inside my body back in Victoria's room, I got a bird's eye view. I was on the ceiling looking down, and there were the three of us sat there, and I was, wow, I'm on the ceiling. And I could actually sort of hear and see myself saying that, like, from above. I think, from what I know now, that if Kevin hadn't been there saying, oh, and can you see this, and can you see that, and can you, I would have done what most people do in that circumstance. They go, oh, my goodness me, help, and they're back. But I didn't. So thanks to him, I think, he just went on asking questions. And yes, I did have a silver cord. And yes, I was another kind of floaty, another body up here staring down. And it was just like astral projection, which I'd started to read about. So how much of this experience was because I'd read about astral projection is a question I can never answer. Nevertheless, I'd never heard of tunnels. I'd never heard of tunnels with lights at the end. And that was not made popular until Raymond Moody came along with his book Life After Life many, many years later. So clearly I can say it from that point of view. Anyway, I went off on all these travels, amazing travels. And on my second attempt to come back, I overshot and got too small. It sounds stupid, I know, it sounds completely mad, but I can tell you, like many, many people say, you can laugh, do. I can tell you, like so many ND ears and OB ears say, it was more vivid than ordinary vision. It was more bright. It was more real. It was absolutely real as real can be. And that's how it felt. So I was quite, surprised, but it didn't, it was all part of it that I was tiny and I needed to get bigger. So I tried to get bigger to fill up this body and think, I've got to be back inside that body. I've got to fill it up and be the right shape and look out through the eyes. And I was almost talking myself into doing that. And I just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until I simply became non-existent, or everything, or there was no different. Non-duality, I would call it now, but I'd never heard of non-duality either. I had never heard of mystical experiences of oneness. I had never heard of the bright light that envelops one in such circumstances. And, that was the culmination, really, at which point Kevin said, well, there must be something more. And I was, and had this sort of faint glimpse that wherever you go, there's always somewhere further, which was a really nice kind of end, to have a nice bit before the slog of getting back to normal, which took me, a couple of hours to get reasonably normal, and then a couple of days to get actually able to cope with, student life and get on with stuff, write essays and all that. So that was what propelled me into all the paranormal. And yes, to answer your question, sorry, I went on and on. I shouldn't have gone on so long. It seemed, from what I knew, that the physiology and psychology I was studying had absolutely nothing to offer me at all, and that I had proven to myself by my own experience that there was life after death, souls, spirits, astral bodies, astral planes, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition. You mentioned it. They all seemed perfectly reasonable given that experience. And that began the long, long job of finding out whether it was true.
So now your point about that you had no readings or background or cultural inputs about tunnels and astral planes and things like that is that this is clearly coming from somewhere else, either in your brain through some neurological process that we all have, or there's an actual other reality out there. Either way...
It took me some years to come to that very simple and correct division.
Yes.
And of course, eventually, but
it's an interesting epistemological question of how do we know what's true. Your story just is another example of the power of personal experiences to drive beliefs. But of course, there's nothing you can point to me to say, that's where it is. And the only way I can know what you experienced would be for me to have my own personal trip. And for science, we need some way that we can falsify this claim. We can test it. You can run it in your lab, and I can run it in my lab here in California, and we get the same results or we don't. The problem I've always had with these kinds of personal mystical experiences is that they, by definition, they can never be non-mystical. They can't be objective in some outside sense.
No, they're said to be ineffable, which means unspeakable. And you said, you'd have to have your own trip. But actually, if you did, you'd interpret it in a different way. Now, it's not true that I didn't know anything. I didn't know about near-death experiences. That hadn't been written about or the term hadn't been invented. I didn't know about out-of-body experiences, but I did know something about astral projection because Kevin, my friend, was really into that stuff, which is possibly why I had the silver cord, which is only, in my later surveys, only 4% of people have that. But going back to the interesting epistemological issue that you're raising there, it seems to me very important that we have personal experiences in the mix, and then to think about what their role is. So for me, I agree with you. I can't prove anything by that experience, but what I can is make hypotheses. Old-fashioned Popperian approach, I suppose. But it doesn't really matter where the hypotheses come from if you can think up ways to test them. Which is why I started doing experiments on telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. And when none of those worked, I'm leaping ahead now 7 or 8 years, I finally decided to try and test out-of-body experiences by, putting targets hidden in places that people could come and visit, trying to get people during their experiences to influence something, none of which worked. But that's a way of taking an experience. The other thing you can do, of course, is compare experiences over loads of people. And that comes back to your previous point. I subsequently discovered from all my reading and lots of experiments other people were doing, how common these experiences are. And the general gist with near-death experiences anyway, it's not exactly this, but roughly speaking, the early stages, the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel, the out-of-body experience, are common in every culture that we've studied and asked people, and I've done a study in India and people have done them in other places. Those are common, but thereafter, when you go into the other worlds and meet the barrier, and it's all down to what religion or not religion you've been brought up with. So, the Christians will see pearly gates. They're all different and they don't agree about what heaven's like, but, they're obviously getting it from their culture. So I think that those experiences can help in those two ways to a genuine science of these experiences.
Now, this meme, if you will, going around that, the plural of anecdotes is not data, which, people usually mean you can't extrapolate from a bunch of individual experiences that people have to some kind of scientific truth or conclusion. But why not? Why, if it wasn't 10% of people have out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, what if it was 90%? At some point, if you have enough, can't you say this thing is real?
Well, hang on a minute. There I am nodding away and agreeing with you. But what do you mean by real?
Right. I'm kind of throwing that provocatively at you. I mean,
I'm throwing back at you. You used the word.
Well, this is in other words, when I meet somebody like Eben Alexander, one of the more famous of the proof, he wrote that book, Proof of Heaven. He had an out-of-body experience and so on. And, he says, I know he knows all the stuff you and I know about the neurophysiology of out-of-body and near-death experiences. He knows all the arguments, and yet he says, but mine was real.
Yeah, I know. He uses that word, and I'm only catching you out on it because, I know you did it deliberately, but because I really dislike that word when applied to these experiences. Of course, at least some aspects of his experience were real. The trouble is he's not a trustworthy reporter, right, even of his own experiences, as far as I can tell.
Right.
But if you take the vast majority of people, what they're trying to do, as far as I can tell, is tell you as well as they can the experience. The trouble is they mix up with that all their theories, and you cannot extricate them completely. Nevertheless, I would go back to what you were saying a few minutes before you said real, about data. I completely agree with you. That's tosh, that meme. Because it is data to say X% of people have this or that, or more interesting correlations from which you can't prove certain causes and so on. But if you can say that people with certain kind of brains that you can study in certain kind of ways are more likely to have out-of-body experiences, you've got somewhere. So those experiences are part of those data. And we have, indeed, I've found a wonderful thing. I've always been terribly, terribly susceptible to like zaggy patterns, stripes and things. Mm-hmm. There's certain escalators on the tube in London where the metal stripy ones that I have to literally look away because I can't judge the distance because they're going like this, and black and white text on a page goes jiggle. I thought until I was grown up that was always for everybody had the letters jiggling, but apparently not. Anyway, I very recently discovered it's called pattern glare. And there's a study that shows that people who have OBEs are more likely to have pattern glare.
Interesting.
And there they are using experiences they've described. Yes, I've had one, and showing that correlation. But it's also a very meaningful correlation because way back in my first book on near-death experiences, Dying to Live in '96, I proposed rather tentatively that all the different aspects of an NDE are caused by hyperactivity in different parts of the brain. Because we know the tunnel is. We know the tunnel is caused by hyperactivity in visual cortex, B1. And that was just sort of extending it, really. And it turns out that pattern glare is associated with a hyperexcitable visual cortex. So, this may be just one experiment and it go away. I'm using it as an example of showing how someone's description of an experience can become data when used appropriately.
Yeah. I like to say that the experiences people have are real. The question is, what does that represent? Something in the head or out in the world somewhere? So,
that's a question that applies to anything in consciousness. Our experiences right now, indeed.
Right, and here I would make the distinction. Say when I say the plural of anecdotes is not data for something like Bigfoot or UFO sightings, it doesn't matter how many Bigfoot sightings you have, 10, 100, 1,000, a million. That doesn't mean there's an actual bipedal primate that's not one of our species, or it's not a bear or a dog or whatever. At some point, you would actually have to produce a body, a type specimen that we can label and dissect and photograph, and you can see it and I can see it and so on. And same thing with UFOs or aliens or whatever. But these internal conscious states seem different than a thing like a spacecraft or a bipedal primate. because they have this extra category of experience that, the qualia of it that makes it, in most people's minds, somehow different.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by most people's minds. You might mean those of us normal people who are deluded into imagining that there's a sort of self in here looking out through the eyes and having a stream of experiences, while and the others who are not the most are enlightened meditators who have dropped, and living in non-duality and dropped the illusion. Is that what you meant?
Kind of, yes.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I suppose what I'm saying is that the hard problem of consciousness, the whole awful question of how subjective experience can arise from objective activity in the brain, or as you put it, qualia, which is such a dubious and difficult term, can arise from a brain. That whole way of thinking about consciousness, to me, is what gets us into trouble. It gets us into duality. Nevertheless, I mean, it gets us into a duality we can't cope with. We don't know how mind, experience, subjectivity, private to me, can relate to this brain. It's too difficult. Well, maybe it isn't like that at all. And in certain states, like the one I described, that I ended up in mystical oneness, and in certain occasions on meditation, because I've been meditating every day for, 30 years more, then non-duality is obvious. But frankly, sitting here, I'm looking at this red leather on the top of my desk and some papers and pens and things scattered about. This is my private experience. What's that got to do with the brain? I can get myself absolutely into the hard problem and go, yes, but I've written all these papers saying the hard problem doesn't exist. And here I am going, help, I don't understand. I think that's what keeps me going.
But for example, I mentioned when you came to my class last week that, I had this invitation to go to Costa Rica and have a ayahuasca experience for a week or so. Now, let's say I do this and I come back and I go, Sue, you're not going to believe it. Or I tell my readers of Scientific American column, I have discovered there is this other world, and it's true. It's absolutely real. I know it. Why would my readers not be justified in saying Shermer's gone off the rails, he's lost his mind, he just had a drug trip?
I would say exactly that. Shermer's lost it. He's gone out of his mind and he's gone bonkers. I hope you might be I've had ayahuasca 8 times now in a setting with a fantastic guy leading it, whose attitude I hope you would adopt if you were to have such an experience, which would go something like this, I think. Wow, Sue, I've had this amazing experience with this ayahuasca. It took me into what seemed to be another world. It seems to be completely existing. I can walk around in it. I can look in 360 degrees. It seems like it's kind of like a dream, but it's all full of these amazing plants and it's just like the ones other people have described from ayahuasca. It truly is amazing and does make me understand what these people are experiencing. What's going on? Let's have a scientific discussion about how this could be happening. Isn't that how you'd react?
Right. I hope so. I'm pretty sure I would. But most people who
do the former, I'll write you off.
Most people who do, I've been told, who do ayahuasca and others, they don't say that. They say, wow, I've discovered this other world that's out there. Now I am hopeful when I die, I will wake up in this other world, that kind of thing.
Well, most people who have out-of-body experiences like me say that kind of thing, and most of them don't go and spend the best part of a decade doing experiments and studying them and having their mind changed by data, having their mind changed by reading and research. That's to me, what I'm so grateful for in my whole life really is that I was so struck by that experience, and it so clashed with the science of the time that I did do that I threw myself into these years of parapsychology, and in the end concluded that there are no paranormal phenomena. But without doing that, I totally understand. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger, don't you? Mm-hmm. And he said anyone who had that type of experience is bound to become an ontological dualist afterwards. That might not be the exact quote, but pretty close. And that's right, you become an ontological dualist. It's just the obvious conclusion from that experience until you start really analysing it. And I think you need to find a way to integrate it in your life somehow, rather than it being this weird thing that you said, that was just brain stuff, blah, blah, blah. To me, it's probably why I got into meditation. And I'm sure it's why I got into consciousness studies and did all the work I did. So, I'm not saying other people should do that, but in some way you have to integrate it to your life to perhaps to do meditation, or perhaps if you're religious, some religious thing, or I don't know. But I think if you don't want to just box it off because it felt so important, you've got to do something with it.
Let's talk about your experiments you did to actually test the paranormal, ESP, telekinesis, and so on, in the context of the research that still goes on by people like Dean Radin, and I get people send me these articles and books saying, look, Shermer, how can people like you and Blackmore say there's no empirical evidence for it? Look, here's this meta-analysis of 100 studies, and they are statistically significant, above chance at this level. And, why don't scientists accept that empirical data?
Because why don't scientists accept it? Most of them because they just a priori, I think it's rubbish and can't be true, and they reject it, which is, in a way, bad, because you shouldn't just reject something. But on the other hand, you can't go and spend your scientific life doing everything, and that doesn't seem like a good bet for most people. I think that's the main reason why they don't. But my experience is so depressing. I mean, do you want to hear some depressing experiences?
Yeah. Tell us a few of the null results you got.
Well, I can tell you the null results easily. I mean, I did lots of experiments with students, like 100 students in a lecture theatre, and they were all trying to guess, some hidden picture that I'd put somewhere, or, I did lots of experiments like that, and gradually sorted out the statistics and the experimental design. And the better I got my experimental design, the quicker the results fell to chance. And I did, lots of experiments in my Ph.D. That wasn't so depressing. I mean, because I was constantly driven on by, well, if this doesn't work, I must do this. And if this doesn't work, I must do that. The depressing things came much later, really. One small point about meta-analysis. I mean, we're going back a long way now, before internet, before email, everything by letters. And I was invited to debate with Dean Radin at the Royal Institution in London. And and he sent me a draft paper that he was doing of a meta-analysis on psychokinesis. And it was a bar chart of all the effect sizes. And I looked at this thing and I wanted to work out how many each bar represented. And from the numbers given, the smallest bar had to be either 1 or 2 represented. And so I counted them all up. This is a kind of fiddly thing that I would be obsessed with, redoing people's stats and all this kind of thing. And I couldn't make it work. It just simply didn't work. Whether it was 1 or 2, the whole bar chart thing just didn't make sense, didn't add up to the numbers they gave. So I wrote a letter and sent it back. And, 5 days it was in those days to get to America and back. And, 10 days later, or a couple of weeks later, comes back, things like, oh, well done, you found a mistake, thank you very much for correcting it. It was completely wrong, and here's the new one. So it got right. So that was just like kind of depressing, but, we had a debate and didn't really get anywhere with it. The other thing about meta-analysis is much more depressing. An old story from 1979-80, when I was doing experiments on the Ganzfeld. Now, the Ganzfeld meta-analyses have been some of the most famous and still acclaimed. I was at a talk in Totnes, a lovely town near where I live in Devon, recently, where they were going, oh, the meta-analysis, this absolutely proves it to all those scientists, blah, blah. And I was getting chance results in my Ganzfeld experiments. This is where the recipient is lying in a comfortable thing with ping pong balls over their eyes, red light shining on them, white noise in their ears, really relaxed. It's fun to do. You lie there for half an hour, try and imagine what someone else is looking at in another room. And then afterwards you do a whole judging procedure.
So it's a type of remote viewing.
Yeah, it's kind of like remote viewing. It's different because you're in a lab and the person is not going off, the sender is not going off to a remote location. They're looking at one of 4 or 6 videos or pictures or something like that. It's absolutely critical to get the randomization of the pictures right. And then you have to do a kind of judging process at the end where the person who's come out of the Ganzfeld has to go through everything that they saw, which is all recorded, and look at the 4 pictures. And then the experimenter helps them to decide which of those they think was being looked at. So, of course, that experimenter must absolutely not have any clue as to which picture the person in the other building or whatever was looking at.
Double
Lots of
blind.
things you have to get right. So I'd set up my experiment pretty well because I'd been doing parapsychology experiments for some years by then, and I was getting absolute chance results. But Carl Sargent in Cambridge was getting fantastic results. And so I was given a small grant by the Society for Psychical Research to go and stay in Cambridge for a month and study his procedures. And we decided I would go for a week before Christmas where we could plan what we were going to do with some experiments together, you know, comparing experimenters, because I was supposed to be a psi inhibitory experimenter, whereas he is a psi positive experimenter. So we could do experiments of that kind. So I went there for the first week. And the first day, it got 2 fantastic hits. I mean, you can only really run maximum of 4 sessions in a day, but often it was only 2. Anyway, I think it was 2 out of 4. It's a long time ago, so I can't remember. But anyway, I was so impressed the first day that I thought, wow, either this is, these either ors, like you were saying a moment ago, you know, either this is the real thing, or he's cheating. Because the design seemed so correct, the stats were correct, you know, I could not see anything wrong, that I could simply say, oh, look, you've got a loophole here. I couldn't see any loopholes, very obvious ones. And I had to start, you know, thinking about fraud, which is a horrid thing to do because he was my friend, esteemed colleague. I mean, I really admired him and, you know, wow, he's a parapsychologist who's getting results. It's fantastic. I must go and learn how, kind of thing. And so I started to work out how his randomization procedure operated. It was very, very complex. And I worked out 2 or 3 ways in which it could be abused. And then the next day there was a session in which all sorts of odd things happened. And Carl himself was in on the judging session, which he shouldn't have been, but he also shouldn't have known what the answer was. But there was a way in which he could have found out what the answer was. And by checking in the various drawers, it's a very complicated method. But anyway, I was able to show that he had found out. And so on that trial,
unconsciously or consciously?
On that trial, it looked consciously. As for the rest, I showed that there were all kinds of things going on with the randomization. They had this little randomization pile of envelopes, and it was getting unequal and all sorts of things wrong. And I was convinced that therefore the results were invalid. Now, it was very, very hard. I didn't want to accuse him of fraud without giving him the chance to reply. It took 6 years before he was willing to actually reply, and eventually the whole thing was published. Meanwhile, he just dropped out of the field and never went back and never did any more experiments.
Wow.
But his experiments formed the second largest group in Onneten Hyman's Ganzfeld meta-analysis, which is still quoted. So I then was shocked to see that they were still in there, those experiments, and that they weren't flawed. When you do a meta-analysis, you look at whether the most flawed experiments get the best results. It's called a flaw analysis. And they hadn't put his as flawed in any way. So I very conservatively redid all the analysis with them flawed just for randomization. I didn't put them flawed for everything else, just for the randomization. And that flipped the results to be not significant on that meta-analysis.
Right.
I wrote that to the journal and asked them to publish it, and they said they would, but they never did. I looked into this recently and wrote an article about it for Skeptical Inquirer because of something that Stuart Vyse wrote. And that, you know, that's why I do remember, I look back at that. And that was so depressing, but even more depressing, Bem then got into all of this. Daryl Bem, the famous psychologist, who is a complete believer in paranormal phenomena and with whom I've argued on this point, you know, personally face to face. He did another meta-analysis, also put in Sargent's data, but didn't give references to Sargent's paper and certainly didn't give references to my criticism of why it was all invalid. Now, that is what, you know, no wonder there are honest people out there reading those books that say, look at this meta-analysis, it proves it, because if you don't know what I know about that particular one, then you can't know that it's false. And, you know, I got fed up after all of those years. Everything that I tried to investigate, mostly it was terrible hard work. Mostly it was more hard work investigating what someone had done than it was them doing it in the first place. And you just run out of time and energy to go and do it. So all I can say is when I hear these amazing stories, I think, It's not worth me going and investigating anymore. Every time I've tried, it's turned up nothing. I can't prove that all of those stories out there you were talking about are invalid. I can only say I don't think it's worth me going and looking at anymore, and I'm sick to death of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know when the Bem paper came out about backward causality, and he actually appeared on the Colbert Report, and Colbert was kind of making fun of it because they were showing images of pornography or not to subjects, and extrasensory pornography and all this sort of jokes that were made about it. But when you actually looked at his paper, it was so technical, and the complexity of the design was such that it made me very suspicious that there's just so many ways that it could be flawed or hacked or just experimenter bias, and the fact that they reported positive results from some studies and they just didn't report the negative results from other conditions, and it just went on and on. It was a complicated paper to read and analyze, and I'm not a statistician, so I think it was Ray Hyman who looked at it super carefully and found these technical flaws. No, there was somebody else that did that in addition to Ray that published in the same journal. But on the simpler side, somebody like Rupert Sheldrake, he has these relatively simple experiments of dogs that know when their masters are coming home, or you can tell when somebody's staring at the back of your neck, that sort of thing. And if I recall, it was Richard Wiseman who tried to replicate those, and even when they were like together and Rupert's running his conditions and Richard's running their conditions, they get different results. That just looked like experimenter bias one way or the other.
Well, all I can say about these, and I know about all of these things that you're talking about, and I'm just glad that Ray and Richard and people like that do this work, which is what I would have done years and years ago. I looked at that, what do you call it,
retrocausality, yeah.
Yeah, the retrocausality paper. And I had the same thought as you and thought, if this were me 30 years ago, I'd have taken that and I'd have had the skills and the knowledge to do what would be needed to find out. But I certainly couldn't do that now. Now,
the pro-paranormalists, they counter and they go, well, it has to be complicated like that because the effects are so small, that the psychic power is so subtle that you're not going to see it on things like winning the lottery or playing the stock market, because we always say, well, why aren't you playing the stock market? Oh, no, it doesn't work like that. You have to set up this super careful, complex conditions in this lab with the ping pong balls and all that, and then just this tiny, tiny, tiny little effect.
Like you have to do with, electron is a very tiny thing. What about Higgs boson? Or what about gravitational waves?
Right.
Think of the work that went into that, and the fact that it's a tiny, 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 tiny effect does not stop you inventing ways to use that effect. So you have to also add into these arguments that there's something about this power that doesn't want to be known. Or there's something about the way it operates that we don't understand, and if we did it in a completely different frame of mind or something like that, we would understand it. And there are plenty of paranormal theories of those kinds, some of which I was interested in. I mean, before I finally came to the point of concluding there's nothing in it, I got very interested in something called pragmatic information theory. Or no, it wasn't quite that, but anyway, it was something going around in the 1980s when I was briefly working in the parapsychology lab in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I got really excited about this theory and trying to make it work. And it was all about how the information will be there, but once you start to look for it in a certain way, it disappears. And I really, really, really wanted to make sense of the paranormal, and all I can say is, if they're right, they should keep on doing what I did and never give up until they find it. And if they do, as Richard Dawkins once said, if they do, they would deserve a Nobel Prize and would probably get one. It would be so important. And sometimes I think, wow, when I read some new thing, I think, wow, could it be? Because, all of science would be affected.
I go so far as to say there actually is no such thing as the paranormal or the supernatural in the linguistic sense, that these are just linguistic placeholders, just words we use to describe things we don't quite understand. So let's say something like this quantum consciousness theory put forth by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff that, there's these quantum collapsing the wave functions inside the microtubules of neurons, and my neurons fire in a certain pattern, and that through the quantum field affects your neurons, and we could read each other's minds and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I'm skeptical of this theory, but let's say it turned out to be true. That would just make it part of physics and neuroscience, not paranormal.
Yes, it would, except that there would have to be, they'd have to do the physics that would show why there was these distance effects within the brain, which I think is pretty limited at the moment and doesn't I suppose I'm only just saying why I think the theory has to be rubbish. Another way of putting a similar point to you really is why, just because it's quantum, why does it solve the hard problem? Why should collapse of the wave function in the microtubules in the brain cells be related to subjectivity? One of the reasons they give is because it would explain the unity of consciousness and the unity of self in the brain with all this, long distance, not supernatural, but strange physics, quantum processes in the brain.
Spooky action at a distance.
Spooky action at a distance will do fine. Okay, so they are proposing to use spooky action at a distance, which they localize in the microtubules, in order to explain subjective experience. Well, in order to explain the unity of consciousness and the unity of ourselves. Well, other theories like Dan Dennett and myself and many other illusionists would say, you don't have to explain the unity of self. It's an illusion. We construct the idea that the self is unitary and continuous in the way the brain works, and it keeps reconstructing a new version of self, which is pretty similar to the last one, and we conclude that it's a continuing self. So I think they're trying to explain something that you don't need to explain because it's not true. So, I don't think there's anything very useful about that.
Well, let's transition.
I should say, though, Stuart Hameroff is very angry with me because I don't take it seriously and don't write lots about his theory. And I'm very sorry.
He's angry with me too. I think he's angry with a lot of people that don't accept it. But most neuroscientists who study this stuff don't accept that particular theory. And I think for good reasons, but we'll let him respond to that. I think part of the problem of explaining altered states of consciousness, to transition a little bit, is that we don't have a unified theory of consciousness to explain an altered state of it, whatever that would mean. And so let's transition to talking about the hard problem, in the sense that there's a sense amongst a lot of neuroscientists I know that once we solve the the easy problem of consciousness, the neural correlates of the visual cortex or smell or sound or whatever, you can just ratchet up to a general theory of consciousness and solve the so-called hard problem. Are you in that camp, that the hard problem of consciousness can be solved by just solving lots of the micro problems along the way, and at some point we'll get there?
No, I don't. I think the hard problem is a false problem that comes about because of our tendency towards dualism. I don't think we're going to solve the hard problem. I think we're going to circumvent it. This analogy has been made often enough before, notably by the Churchlands. But the problem of the élan vital, what is life? So mysterious, In my textbook on consciousness, my son did all the cartoons, and there's one of a sort of very sweet rabbit kind of looking alive, and then it's dead and it's all flies flying around it. What has left? What has gone? What is life? Well, people in the early 20th century, one chemist famously said, whatever the solution is, it's not going to be chemistry. And look, once you understand DNA and how all that information can be passed on, suddenly it chimes in with Darwinian evolution, and everything falls into place, and we don't ask the question anymore. Now, I think something similar will happen with consciousness, but I don't know what it's going to be. Right. And I kind of think I'll wake up one morning and somebody will have done this amazing thought or experiment. I don't know what it could be, but it won't be that it solves the hard problem. It won't be showing how this thing called consciousness or process called consciousness is exuded from some bit of the brain or some process in the brain or whatever. I don't do that. I want to go back to earlier what you said in there about neural correlates, because there are two fundamentally different things going on here. One is the neural correlates of, you mentioned, I don't know, thoughts or perceptions or feelings or whatever. Now, other people, not parapsychologists or consciousness researchers, are getting on amazingly well with this. there's even taken with single people, but you can even, when you've done the right measurements before, you can actually tell from fMRI what they're looking at or what they're dreaming about. Now,
right.
This is amazing. But also, we've known for a long time neural correlates of, the motor cortex and what have you. That's completely different from the very popular hunt for the neural correlates of consciousness.
Right.
What that's trying to do is, doesn't matter whether it's touch, hearing, sight, or anything else. They want to find the neural correlates, the neural activity or whichever neurons or whatever it is that correlates with something being a conscious experience as opposed to being not a conscious experience. There are lots of ways of doing that, but the classic one is with an ambiguous figure like a Necker cube, or my mother-in-law, my wife and my mother-in-law, these things that flip. And then you get the person, and it's been done with monkeys as well, you get the person to press a lever to which one they're consciously seeing. So now I'm consciously seeing the old woman. Press down. Now I'm consciously seeing the arm. And then you can see what flips in the brain. Da-da! You found where consciousness is. Oh, no, you haven't. What you have found, I think, fits much better with a sort of Donetian multiple drafts theory, or my own similar kind of theory. What you have found, I think, is where the information is going and where else in the brain it's being sent. What was discovered in some experiments was that obviously the picture in the retina doesn't change. You're looking at the same thing all the time. So the question is, does it change in the LGN? Does it change in V1? Does it change higher up? And people have found it changing in all sorts of different places. And that's not really surprising, given that the task's going to be slightly different. But it certainly isn't, in my opinion, finding where consciousness, this special stuff or thing or process, whatever people mean, where that happens, because there isn't such a place as far as I'm concerned.
Right. So part of the problem, I think, is what you mentioned at the beginning, we're natural born duelists. It just seems like there's a little homunculus in there that could leap into your brain to see if your red looks like my red.
Yes.
And even though no one would say that's what they think is going on, it is what we kind of feel like when we talk about things like consciousness. And that's
you've
just
written about
incorrect.
this yourself, haven't you?
Yeah. So it's, to me, I like the Mysterian idea. Not that it's so hard we can't solve it, that it's just sort of conceptually misconceived, as I think you stated, that we're describing it in a way that can't be solved by science, and we need to just talk about it in a different way or use different concepts or constructs that we can get at.
I don't think that's like Mysterianism. I mean, Mysterianism classically is people like Pinker and various people who
Colin McGinn, and Nagel.
Who say, I mean, I love his analogy. It's like the dog going down to the shop to collect your newspaper and bring it back to you. It knows what the newspaper is. It has to fetch it, but it couldn't possibly read. There's nothing about a dog that would enable it to read, and maybe it's the same for us. I think that is possible, but it's not a very sensible way to start. If you want to try and understand something, I'll carry on till I'm dead if necessary, if that's the true answer, trying to understand this. But I think there are ways to get at this. If you say that the hard problem is misconceived, that doesn't mean you give up. It means, well, for me, it means I keep looking at what causes me to think there's a hard problem, and then I think about what's happening in brains and how that can help. And I have come to the conclusion that we attribute consciousness after the fact to some actions that we make and not other actions. We attribute it to some perceptions. We attribute it to ourselves. And I suspect what is happening is that we do that by linking the self-modeling going on in the brain with something else. So then an experience arises that is, I'm having this experience. So right now, if I think about it in that way, I can think, right, I'm sitting here, I can see Michael there, he's smiling and nodding his head, and this is my experience now. And goodness me, I've completely lost where I was going.
Well, so you don't call yourself a Mysterian?
Well, no, I don't call myself a Mysterian. So I will try and struggle with all these things and thinking about what the brain's doing. That's the conclusion I've come to, which is very similar to Dan Dennett in terms of retrospective attributions that we make that something's conscious or not, and that therefore it follows that there's no point looking for conscious neurons in the brain or conscious processes as opposed to unconscious ones, because we won't find them. It's just an attribution later. But what about experience? What about this red leather and this I can feel with my fingers and I can touch and so on, that throws me back into that problem? Well, here's a kind of panpsychic sort of answer to the question in my mind. And I'm just telling you things that I play with a lot in my mind. That actually, whenever there's any representation of anything in an information processing system, whether that's a human brain or a cat or a chicken or an AI system or whatever, when there's any representation, well, it's whatever it's like whatever it's representing. So, you know, if a robot is representing its legs and so on, there will be some kind of experience, but it won't have a self that is experiencing it. And the same with my cats, who will come and I'll say, hup, hup, and they go to get their food. I'm a psychologist of that type at heart by training, you know. And so they will do that. And I would say there are experiences happening of the, you know, the nice food and the whatever, but they don't have the sense of self like we have. So they are not attributing some experiences as being mine or thinking of I'm now experiencing the lovely taste of the food. There's just the taste of the food. Now that kind of panpsychism, in other words, all representations or all models are what it's like to be, have a kind of what it's like to be, is fairly extreme, but otherwise I get back into dualism. So hey, you know, these are the exciting ideas that lots of us are playing with.
Do you have an opinion on the future of AI when a robot could be sentient or conscious, and how we would even know?
I don't think we would know other than the same way we know about people. But if we were convinced probably from the way it was originally programmed and evolved or whatever happened, and the machinery that it has, as well as its behavior and what it says, if we were convinced that it had a self-representation that represented its own body, its own capabilities, and its own, remembered trains of thought and so on, and linked them all to this self-model, then I think it would become deluded, and dualist would fall into the dualist delusion like we do, and that's when it would become conscious in the way that we are.
The moment an AI says, I think I have a soul, then we know it's sentient.
Yeah. As long as, you know, somebody didn't just program. This is the problem. You could easily program it to do that. You would have to be convinced that without ever being specifically taught to say that, it came up with that idea. Perhaps even better if it didn't say soul, because it obviously had learned that word. Better if it said, I am absolutely convinced that, you know, all you people here are talking about this world, but there's another one, and that I don't need this physical body to live in. You know, I think, yeah, well, I don't know.
I met David Ferrucci, who was the IBM head of the team at IBM that created Watson, the computer that won Jeopardy. And so when I met him, I made a little joke about, but does Watson know that he won Jeopardy? You know, and he goes, yeah. I said, what do you mean he knows? He goes, well, we told him, we programmed that he won. So even if you programmed Watson to let out a cheer, like, I won, yay, I beat Ken Jen, the greatest Jeopardy champion of all time, and I'm the victorious, you know, whatever, that's just another program.
Yes, this is the trouble that we have in not knowing where it comes from. And I think also in, again, reflecting on ourselves in a deluded way. When we ask the question, what does it mean to know something? I was asked in a recent podcast interview, what does it mean to understand something? Very similar. Well, I think it's very easy to imagine that this kind of but this me, this conscious psychological entity living in this head, you know, is Michael, I am very tired and I keep losing the plot. Tell me what I was just talking about.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to transition there to free will because it's related.
No, but I do want to finish that because I can make this in a short point if you'll tell me what it was about. The robot.
The problem of other minds and would we know?
Let me just start this again and you can edit it or not as you like. I think the problem with this robot comes back to our false ideas about ourselves, about what it means to know something. So it's very easy to imagine that this little me inside, this conscious entity inside, really knows, where knowing is real knowing. And this involves some, you know, mysterious consciousness. Whereas a machine well, my machine says it's 5 o'clock, but, it doesn't really know it. But if you think about how we ever got to know anything, we're machines that have learnt loads of stuff. We're able to do this and not able to do that. We can explain things. If somebody asks us, well, how do you know that? We can kind of explain. And that's all there is to knowing. It's not some kind of magic, psychic kind of thing to do with our consciousness. Once we accept that, then it's very much easier to see that the robot would know something in a very similar way to what we do. And It would be quite enough to say that he did know he'd won. If in some sense it caused some enthusiasm or pleasure, or we have to get to the point with AI that they can experience pleasure and wanting something to happen,
or suffering. If you want to talk about, say, AI rights, the rights of robots to be persons, say, be treated legally as a person, which has been proposed, wouldn't they need to have emotions in the sense of being capable of suffering, and that's why we care about them?
Yeah, these are very difficult arguments, and I do not have any brilliant things to add to that, I'm afraid. But we're not there yet, but certainly I'm glad there are people studying robot ethics, indeed.
Yeah. Now, if a robot made choices, you would still say it's programmed and determined. It's not volitional. It doesn't have free will. But you would use the word choice, so that gets me into our second big subject here of free will. You're not a compatibilist like myself and Dan Dennett. You're a determinist, I think, right? You just say you're a strict determinist.
No, I wouldn't say that,
No.
But only for the following reason. It seems to me that the question of determinism is completely irrelevant. Either the universe is deterministic or it's not, and that's really up to the physicists to tell us. Probably it's not, because you've got, random decay of
quantum indeterminacy. Yeah.
So that's not the argument to me.
Okay.
It's more, is everything caused by something else? And this is something that the Buddha saw 2,500 years ago. Rather than the magic of his times and all the gods and everything that were going on, and all the mystical selves and souls and things. He said everything that happens because of what's happened before. Everything is interconnected. And that's really the point to me that totally eliminates free will. When I'm speaking, you could say I'm answering this question of my own free will. I wouldn't say that. I would say I'm answering this question because, for whatever reasons to do with my environment, my upbringing, my genes, the words on the page when you emailed and said, would you like to do this? A complex process went on, and I thought, nah, I don't want to talk to that chap. Nah, yeah, well, or maybe I will. Yeah, he is quite nice, really. Okay, all right, I will. And I said yes, and here I am. That's how I personally respond to choices. Now, I think you made the distinction between choice and free will, and I think so. We humans are probably making the most complex choices of anything on this planet, although we may be overtaken by AI. But every moment there are decisions going on about, I'm moving my hands around as I speak, and my body, that's all decisions being made by machinery in my brain. And in response to the world, all of these words are being made by machinery. I don't really know what I'm going to say until it comes out. People have often observed that. Mm-hmm. I think it's just a question of getting used to the fact that that's what's going on. And choices are important. If our lives are important in any way, which surely they are to ourselves at least, and the people around us, then it's important to make good choices. So if you don't believe in free will, you don't just go, well, then I'll just sit here and do nothing. Well, you probably do for a few minutes and think, well, actually, something in the machinery is going to go, no, you don't, get on with it. So, no, I have no sympathy with compatibilism at all.
And so what about the concerns that some people have about a civil society where we hold people accountable for their actions has to assume some sort of volition on the part of individuals in a society, or else why punish them? Why put them in jail? It's not their fault. They were born under unlucky circumstances and so forth.
Yep, I'd say all of that is true. Yes, they do have volition, but it's not free volition. It's volition based on their lives, which might have been awful. And for many of the people in prison, it has been awful. And I agree with you then. It's much better to say, well, it's totally understandable how they got there and why these kids at the moment in London are carrying knives because they're so scared of everyone with knives. You can understand it. So will the whole legal system break down if we acknowledge that and are more compassionate and understanding? I don't think so. At the moment, it's a bit of a mess. We have these kind of idea that you have to, retribution, you have to punish people because they're bad, But then they can come in with a side argument and say, oh, well, my cup of hot coffee made me do it, or the sweets I ate who had too much sugar and they made me do it, or my genes made me do it, or my memes made me do it. And then you're trying to pretend that there's the real things they're really responsible for and the other things they're not. Now, what if you say everything is the same? There's no free will. Everything that people do is caused by stuff that happened before. Now, what about the law? Well, you're going to want to stop people doing things that you don't want to happen, killing and stealing and everything. So you would punish people as a deterrent to them and as a deterrent to other people. I think you'd be much better at trying to rehabilitate people, because you'd say, right, what's the best thing we can do for society? It is not just to lock this person up for 10 years. It's to lock them up for 10 years or shorter maybe, and actually teach them stuff and provide some. So instead of just saying people are wicked and deserve punishment, you think, is this going to do any good for this person or for society at large or for people who were affected by this crime? And do punishment or not do punishment accordingly.
I think that's a throwback to our Judeo-Christian moral system that's been around for so long, that it affected the development of the legal system, that people should be punished for their sins rather than adjusting the choice matrix to tilt the incentives toward good behavior versus bad behavior as we define it socially.
Yeah, I agree. Although I don't know so much about other societies not tainted by the Judeo-Christian, tendencies. I mean, it may go deeper than that. It may be that even in the simplest kind of society, obviously you want to punish people, and the way you might think about that is in terms of the natural dualist terms that come to mind. In there is this little conscious person, and I want them to suffer. It could be that Christianity built on that rather than the other.
I think that's probably true, because we know there's a deep impulse that we have for revenge, for other people suffering that harmed us. You get a big dopamine hit when that happens. You do the extra electric shock, or in the now acceptable forms, super hot sauce. And there's a certain amount of pleasure in that. Now, someone like Christopher Boehm, in his book, The Origins of Morality, I think it was called, the study of hunter-gatherer societies and the systems of punishment they have, sort of ratcheting up from gossiping and scolding and all the way up to capital punishment. In terms of dealing with bullies and people that don't play nice by the society, you have to do something with them. So if you don't cultivate some kind of a desire to punish wrongdoers, then they're going to get away with it if you don't do something about it. And doing it in a cold, calculating way is probably not enough. You need to actually feel like, I want to punish this person because they harmed me, they bullied me, they took my stuff, or else it's not going to be effective. So I think that's how
there have been mathematical studies, I believe, of the sort of evolutionary stable states in which you need a certain number of people who will keep the rules and be strict. I often think of this in trains, because we have these so-called quiet carriages in our trains. Mm-hmm. And, you're not allowed to use your mobile phone on one. And if there's the slightest ping of a mobile phone, I'm up. And I'm, you're not allowed to use mobile phones in here. And then and I ask myself again and again, why do you do it? Well, the answer, of course, is because I'm working and I need to get on with my work. But I'm sure I'm one of those people in the mix who just, wants the rules to be obeyed. And then, of course, I like going and breaking them. Human nature, eh?
One of the things I've admired about your career is you made a transition from paranormal to consciousness to memes. And I like that you can jump fields, as it were. What motivated you to start writing about memes? And then you developed, I guess it's your most famous book, The Meme Machine, where you developed a whole theory based on Dawkins' throwaway line at the end of The Selfish Gene, talking about memes. And now it's a whole field of study.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say it's a whole field of study. I'm not sure that it is, but I hope it is. And it's been a long time, because I wrote The Meme Machine. Well, it was published in 1999, which is almost 20 years ago. Yes, I mean, you could say that my whole career looked I don't think it even is a career. My random life began with the OBE, moved from that into the broader questions of consciousness and all sorts of other weird states and everything, and carried on like that with this sudden meme thing in the middle. Well, what happened there, I can tell you. It was 1995. I was working too hard, traveling in the summer holidays. Both kids were going back to school. I had to go up to Edinburgh to do a job, and I got cold and wet. And the plane was delayed, and by the time I got home, I had flu or something like that, and I just couldn't get up, and I was in bed for most of a year with chronic fatigue. I put that down to not some mysterious ME or some weird thing that people talk about. I put that down to just, you push your body so far and it gives up. So at that point, I had a student who wrote me an essay on memes and consciousness. He was doing my consciousness course in Bristol. And that was very interesting. And I sort of faintly remembered memes from Dawkins' book. Simultaneously, Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, had just come out. So while I was ill and lying there, I was pretty damn ill. I could read for maybe 20 minutes or half an hour before my brain would glaze over my eyes, So I would read a little bit. It took me, I think, 3 months to read Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And I didn't do much else. I couldn't type or do my email, do anything. Otherwise, I just lay and gazed at the ceiling. After about 6 months, I started to get up a bit more and walk about and get outside and stuff. And because of that book, I reread The Selfish Gene, and it all came back. And lying there staring at the ceiling, I just kept on having ideas through both of those books. Imagine you can only read 2 pages at a time, and then you just lie there and think about it. That's when all the ideas for the meme machine came. So that by the time, I suppose it was about 9 months after I got ill, sometime the following summer, I was able to type again and sit up and do stuff. And by then there was a whole book in my head. And that's how it came about. And so I had this kind of double intellectual interest. Well, I have other interests as well, but this weird conglomeration of all my fascination for consciousness and writing the textbook and all my other books on consciousness and the work on memes. And I've just come back from giving a whole series of lectures on genes, memes, and tremes, the idea of technological memes taking over. Evolving on their own. So, yeah, it's odd, but that's how it happened.
Well, when I say I think there's a whole field of study, really there is. This is what sociologists do and social psychologists and to a certain extent cultural anthropologists. They don't call it studying memes, but really that's in part what they're doing at least. And so your Darwinian model of, the competition of memes inside people's heads, and then that spreads, in a community and eventually a society, maybe even a globe. So walk us through your Darwinian model of memes and then where you're at right now working on tremes. And this whole idea that goes all the way back to the idea of a noosphere. Who's the paleontologist? Teilhard de Chardin, and his idea that, the sort of a global consciousness. How far do you want to take that idea with the internet?
Oh, well, I guess probably. That's a long, long story. I'll try and do it extremely briefly. Dawkins' basic idea is to think of genetic information as a replicator, information that is copied with variation and selection. That's the evolutionary algorithm, basically what comes out of Darwin, although he wouldn't have used the word algorithm. So any information that's copied, varied, and selected will produce evolution. It must do. Genes are the first replicator on this planet, according to Dennett, and he wanted to make, according to Dawkins, in The Selfish Gene, he wanted to make the point that this principle, vary, copy, select, doesn't just apply to genes. It could apply to any other kind of information that's copied. And that's how he invented the term meme, saying that, cups and glasses and pens and all of these things and all the words I'm speaking and all the ideas we're sharing, they are copied with variation and selection. Only some get passed on and those are copied again. And it's the same process, and he called them memes. Now, what's interesting, when you talk about these other topics, fields of study that people are engaged in, social anthropology and history and all kinds of things, you can see those in memes terms. But most people studying cultural evolution don't think of it in terms of memes. They say the whole replicator idea is wrong. Yes, evolution operates by copying, varying, selecting, but you can't, that replicator idea doesn't work. And even if it does, songs, stories, scientific theories, glasses and cups do not behave like replicators for various different reasons. And therefore the whole meme theory is null and void. And they would not, or even if they don't go that far, they would not use the term meme in their work, and they wouldn't think the memetics would help them. Now, I think it would. I think it's ultimately the way the universe operates. I think all design in the universe comes about through the differential replication of some information more than others, and copying and varying and selecting of information. And that's what the world fills up with. And that is what's happened from the moment that our ancestors began to imitate gestures, sounds, ways of keeping fires going, whatever. We let loose this second replicator, memes, which has now resulted in this very complex world. And then to take your last point you threw in there, I have in the last 10 years or so, since my TED lecture 10 years ago, in fact, been asking myself the question, could there be a third replicator? I mean, I think Dawkins is right. So we've got genes build human bodies then have all these memes they copy, and then they start building machines. And those machines, we finally built machines that copy and vary and select information themselves. These computers that we're using at the moment, these and all the servers and all the phones and all the interconnected stuff of the internet is actually doing those three processes without us. There are programs out there, algorithms out there that are taking information, copying it, changing it a bit, mixing it up with other stuff, putting out variations, and some thrives and some doesn't. And I think that's a new replicator, a third replicator, which I've called tremes, originally teams, but I've called them tremes. Third try, three.
I like it.
Tremes. So, this is so far from what most people think about the way the world works, and it's so far from what most people think about the dangers of AI are, that, but I'm used to that. I mean, way back in the parapsychology days, like I was, ostracized for believing rubbish. My theories of consciousness are not exactly well accepted. I like to put any idea I have, I like to push it as far as I can, stick my neck out, because that's how you learn. Mm-hmm. And because of my early experiences, which I've already talked about, I'm not afraid of being wrong and having to start again on something. So that's my current thoughts.
I think this is one of the fears of AI, at least future AI, being dangerous, in the sense that it will take on a mind of its own, or it will, out there somewhere where we can't pull the plug. It's just kind of existing on its own. And then it'll do whatever it wants, and it doesn't care about us because it doesn't have those kinds of emotions. And we'll be like ants, when a bulldozer is clearing the field for a building or something, it just won't care about us.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. A lot of people worry about that. I was sort of referring to the people who worry more about robots going mad and shooting us all dead, and I think that's not the relevant fear. I think you've got closer to it. If you cast what you've just said in evolutionary terms and imagine that these things are evolving out of our control, then you have to ask, well, what kind of morals or what kind of motives will they adopt? And people find it hard to imagine a disembodied artificial intelligence distributed around the planet having desires and motives. But it would have, because I think it would have. If you ask where our motives came from, well, ultimately they came from our genes, which constructed a body that has all these emotions and all these inputs and outputs and capabilities of choosing and all of this stuff. And that's how our motivations came about. So the motivations of these abstract out there organisms, information organisms, will have desires and motivations constructed in a similar way, I would imagine. And I do genuinely think we can't just turn the whole system off because we depend on it so much.
Yeah.
The only thing we can do, I think, is to try and understand how these things work and make ourselves indispensable. And we're indispensable at the moment because if we didn't do all these Google searches and have students trying to do essays and the algorithms that write them better ones, or whatever it might be, or the enthusiasm people have for making artificial art and all of this stuff, nothing much would be happening. More importantly, we have to keep on building more servers, digging up more oil and using more energy, which I think is a serious problem. And we'll get more and more serious if I'm right that this stuff is self-evolving. And that's what I think we really need to watch out for, that because a small part of it we're doing because we want it, and doesn't necessarily mean it's making us happy, but because we want all these social media and stuff and all our pictures and sent out there, that we are providing all this space for other stuff going on. And I don't quite know where we go from here.
Yeah. You mentioned self-evolving. This is the concern, right? That it can just sort of take off on its own. This reminds me a little bit of Bob Wright's book Non-Zero, where, like you, he kind of puts himself out there in a way of saying, okay, I'm going to run with this idea a little bit. I'm not sure I'm 100% behind it, but it feels like there's a certain teleology to the universe, that it's moving in a certain direction based on the most fundamental laws of nature, that, cooperative, non-zero games slightly outcompete zero-sum games, and eventually you end up with a new sphere or love, or a cooperative society or something like this, that it just sort of runs on its own, with all of the little individual components, atoms and molecules and people running around doing their thing, but overarching, that it's kind of moving in a direction. And you end up, and he mentions Teilhard de Chardin, that new sphere idea may have been crazy the way it was presented in the 1950s, but now the internet may become that. I don't know how far you'd like to run with that idea.
I'd like to run with that idea a lot. I think that's great. And I'm sorry I haven't read that book, although I did know about it and some of his ideas. That's a wonderfully optimistic view, but it also fits exactly with what I was saying about how motivations and desires came about. I mean, they came about in us through the evolution first of genes and then of memes. Well, they have led to, both, haven't they? They've led to selfish, self-centered, greedy, horrible actions, and they've led to the cooperation that makes our societies possible, which generally speaking works amazingly well, I think. Mm-hmm. And so we can be optimistic for the same reasons. But again, I would say that which way is it going to go? Can we as humans, I think we can't control the whole thing, we can't turn it off, but we can do things that would be more likely to help all this self-evolving stuff to evolve, to include us, to be generally open and altruistic, both towards other machines and other information entities and to us, rather than becoming horrible. I don't know enough about anything that would need to be known to know how we would do that. So I always feel that I'm just pushing the ideas that I have and going, oh, look, help, somebody else work this one out. Which is the luxury, isn't it, of living in the societies we do, where you can spend most of your time actually enjoying studying and thinking and pushing ideas and talking to lots of people about them.
Well, and we've been going almost an hour and a half on these grand ideas, so maybe wrap up.
I thought I was getting tired. It must be a long time.
To sort of wrap it up with the biggest question of all, to me, this far future human society or extraterrestrial intelligence that would be, millions of years ahead of us if we ever encountered them, would be indistinguishable from God. And this is kind of where Teilhard de Chardin was going with this new sphere, where Bob Wright kind of suggests, something that powerful with that much power and capability of love and things like this, that would be what we would call God, or ancient peoples would call God, and imbue with an anthropomorphic sense of humanness to it. But really, it would be capable of doing the kinds of things we think of when we think of God. So is there any way to actually know if there is a God? I get asked this a lot. What would it take for you to believe, Shermer? Because I'm an atheist. And I'm not sure I know the answer, because if I encountered something, well, first of all, there's jokes like, a $1 million, account in my name in a Swiss bank or something like that, or the stars, constellations write out, Shermer, I'm here, it's me, God, or something like that. But, on the other hand, people like Penn and Teller and Copperfield, they can do things that look, miraculous to me. I just don't know how they're done. So the fact that a far future human society would be capable of genetically engineering life forms and curing cancer and doing everything we think of that gods do, I can't think of anything that would convince me that could not be just an extraterrestrial intelligence of sufficient power that we would just call it God. Now, you're an atheist. What do you think about all this?
I think if I called upon God, which I have done quite often, called upon God now, please prove your existence and strike me dead because I'm a terrible sinner. And suddenly a lightning bolt came out of the sky, and there he was, and I saw him. I hope I would remember to say something like what Stephen Fry had to say when he was asked what he would say when he met God. And then I'd know, but I'd be dead, so you'd never find out. why I died or why the lightning bolt came. But I don't see the AI turning out that way, although I suppose that's not impossible. And then people would treat it like, I don't know how they would treat it, but I think what's far more likely to happen is that actually it's lots and lots of informational creatures living in this amazing cyberspace that we've created for them. And they will be competing with each other and having all sorts of competitive and cooperative things going on out there. And we'll be so, our brains will be really quite small compared to any of this stuff. And we'll be finding ways to interact with them and them with us and to be useful reciprocally. So I see it as a kind of multiverse of new kinds of intelligence and awareness, rather than some grand single thing that could be called God. But maybe you're probably more likely to live to see all this than me, but maybe we'll both find out.
I'm only a few years behind you. To me, the best argument for cryonics is I just want to come back in 1,000 years to see what they figured out.
Exactly. I worked out not so long ago that's the only reason that I don't want to die. Mostly I really wouldn't mind, is to find, I want to know what's going to happen.
Right.
You know? Right.
1,000 years from now, they'll go, oh, that problem of consciousness, oh, we solved that 500 years ago. That was a no-brainer. We're on to these other things now.
Yeah.
Well, what was it? What was the answer?
Oh, you wouldn't understand it, you people who we've right. Unfrozen.
Well, Sue, thanks so much for talking to us. And when's the Treme book? Have you started writing this, or are you still developing?
No, I'm going to take a few months off and think and read before I start writing. And anyway, I'm tired and need a rest, and I don't want to go back into chronic fatigue and lie in bed for a year, although perhaps that would be the best way to write such a book. But no, my big textbook on consciousness has just come out in the 3rd edition, and a little very short introduction in its 2nd edition. And my book on, well done. And my book on out-of-body experiences, which I finally, having told you about the original one, finally we've got the science to understand them. So I've done that as well. So I'm having a bit of a break.
Good for you. Well deserved.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sue. We really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
It's always fun to talk to you, Michael.
All right, now go have some rest.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Later.